we go. Hi, Peter Charles here, Hooked for Life Fly Fishing. And today I'm going to start a new series on smallmouth fly fishing tactics. We're going to look at a number of different ways to fish for smallmouth, primarily in rivers. I don't do much lake fishing anymore for smallmouth. So if you're looking for lake tactics, I'd suggest looking at conventional anglers, what they do. If you're going to fish from a boat, just imagine being on that boat with a fly rod instead of conventional tackle. But a lot of what they do is applicable to fly fishing. You just have to replicate the tackle in fly fishing gear. So my focus is mostly going to be on rivers. And we're going to go through a number of different ways to fish for smallmouth. But today we're going to look at tackle and what I normally use to fish for smallmouth. And we'll get started, I think, with the reels and lines. That's probably one of the key aspects of smallmouth fishing and the way I approach the game. So let's look at the three lines I have here. I have a Kelly Galoop streamer line, which is has a taper very much like a bass bug line. Very, very little difference. Here I have a beach surf line, which is an intermediate with a floating running line. If you're going to go with sinking lines, always have a floating running line when you're working in a river, because you don't want that running line sinking, hitting the bottom, snagging up and stuff, and being difficult to get out when you want to go for distance. So I have the beach intermediate, which is a great line. Now this is a 7 weight, and you'll notice this is a 6. I tend to use these on the same rods, and we'll get to the rods in a minute. And when I need to really get deep, I have the Streamer Max. This is a short head, so I think it's about 24 feet. And again, it has a floating running line, an intermediate belly, and a high-density front end. It gets quite deep and works extremely well in those deeper, faster runs, or when you're working with a fly that doesn't really want to get down all that much. So those are the lines I use. The streamer line allows me to cast some very large flies. The beach line allows me to get down in typical depths with the types of flies I use, and this is one I really, really need to get down. This is also the one I use in lakes the most as well. And in a lake, with a weighted fly, I've been down over 20 feet with this line, so you can really get down when you need to. As far as reels are concerned, really, simple reels are fine. I mean, I have these very nice Danielsons, and I like to use them. But the reality is I could use simple click and pull reels for smallmouth. You don't need an exotic drag. The other thing I would suggest is don't go too cheap, because with the cheaper reels, one of the problems we get into is right here where the frame meets the spool is they can have a relatively large tolerance, a very big gap, and your running line goes through it. And that's really a nuisance. So I would suggest that, you don't have to go expensive or exotic, but get one that's reasonable quality so you don't run into silly problems. Also, the other thing, too, is if you're fishing in water where you might encounter carp, it's having a good drag on the reel is not a bad thing. So if you tend to do a bit of carp and smallmouth, go for a better reel with a better drag. I've actually fished for smallmouth with the cheap reel that had a disc drag on it, accidentally hooked into about a 15-pound carp. I did land it, but I could barely turn the reel. The drag had heated up so much it was seizing up the reel. So, if you're going to be hitting carp as well, yeah, invest in a better reel. If it's strictly smallmouth, I think you can get away with something a bit cheaper, as long as the fit isn't too sloppy. Now, as far as rods are concerned, I've got my G. Loomis Asquith 6 weight here, and this is my primary smallmouth rod. I do use others. I would say the rod range goes from 5 weight to 8 weight, and really, it's not about the fish. If you're going from one rod to the other, it's more about the size of flies you're going to cast. 5 weight with a 5 weight line is not going to push a big fly into a wind. So you are limiting yourself with a 5 weight. You can upline it with a 6 weight bass bug line. You'll be able to cast bigger flies with that rig. You will be a bit distance limited, but it'll work. So if all you have is a 5 weight, stick a 6 weight bass bug line on it, and you can fish rather effectively for smallmouth. The thing is, when we go up to a 6 weight, then we're opening up the opportunity to use 6 weight and 7 weight lines. We can push some really big lines through the wind, really big flies through the wind, It's a more usable rig for smallmouth. It's good general purpose. It's not too heavy. So it doesn't take the fun out of the fight. All around great rod. So if I was going to go, what's the one rod I'm going to get for smallmouth? It would be a 6-weight, a 9-foot 6-weight. I do have a 7-weight, the IMX Pro streamer rod that I use a lot. And I use that rod mostly as I leave it in my garage because it's a one-piece rod. So it just goes in the car, bomb. It was like those are really quick trips to the river, get an hour's worth of fishing and come home. It's nice and quick and easy, and it's a very enjoyable rod to fish. If I'm going to be casting some really big, ugly poppers like these things, I'm going to be moving up to an 8-weight. I will also use an 8-weight where I'm going to be fishing where there's lots of carp around, and I could be transitioning between smallmouth and carp. You don't want to be undergunned with a carp, as I've just described. So you want to have enough rod and enough reel if you're going to be fishing for carp or if you're going to be fishing really, really big poppers. So either way, an 8-weight is not a bad rod to have, in your arsenal as well. So if you're just going out of a smallmouth and you want the best general purpose rod, a 6-weight is fine. As far as actions is concerned, you don't need anything special there. Good generic action that bends well into the butt, gives you easy distance. You don't need this delicate tip action rod. This is not trout fishing. So, just your general, normal, generic bend and action, and you're good to go. Nothing special there. Now, as far as leaders are concerned, normally, I don't normally use factory leaders, but if I do use them, 2X and 3X are usually typical of what I do use. I often tie my own. If I'm going with sinking lines, I am going with exclusively fluorocarbon. I will move up to a floating line, monofilament line, nylon, when I want to go with a floating line and poppers, because it makes the most sense. The other thing I will do with these factory leaders is if I'm casting poppers, a 9-foot leader gets to be a struggle. So I'll take a little off the tip and a little off the back end, reduce it to about 7 feet, and it'll make popper casting a lot easier. So I think about 7 foot is about the most you want to go when you're casting poppers. If you're fishing streamers on the end of a sinking line and it's not too bulky a streamer, I will use 8 to 10 feet. I like a lot of separation between my sinking line and the fly. It's just the way I fish. A lot of people use about 3 feet. I find I get much better results by using longer leaders because the fly moves better and the sinking line is less likely to interfere with the fish, because that can happen when you're fishing a sinking line. So, as I say, you can make your own leaders or you can buy factory leaders, fluorocarbon if you're using sinking lines or you want to sink off the end of a floater, and nylon monofilament when you want to stay with surface action and poppers. Just remember to shorten them up to around about 7 feet, and you're good to go there with leaders. Now, as far as flies are concerned, I've got 4 fly boxes here. Now, I did put up a video on my top 6 smallmouth flies, but I'm going to deal with more flies today. First off, here we got a nice batch of traditional streamers. Things like the Black Ghost and, others like that, Mickey Fins and Feather Wings, Hair Wings, Bucktails. These work just fine. You can catch a lot of smallmouth on them. They're great fun to use. It's nice catching a fish on a traditional pattern. And yeah, I do use them a lot. Now, when we get into some of the other videos, I'm going to be talking about different fishing techniques. And this box is mostly my twitch flies. There's a few other variants in here. They're all weighted, and they're all designed to be fished either dead drifted or just moving a little bit. They're not designed to be stripped. The streamers are for stripping, okay, not for dead drifting or swinging slowly. This, you can swing slowly, you can dead drift, you can just give it little twitches. This is what these are designed for. They have rubber legs, and so they work extremely well when you're moving them slowly. So if you want to get into those slower presentations, look at something like my twitch fly that has rubber legs, or take a typical woolly bugger and add rubber legs to it. Works like a charm. Now, when we're getting into deeper stuff, These are my heavily weighted flies, the bunny bugs, bass bugs, a headstander fly. I also have some unweighted flies in here too. I have these rabbit wing unweighted flies, and I've got my Weemers in here, my brown trout Weemers. But this is basically, I consider this like my sinking line box. Except for the headstander, I'll use that on a floating line quite often. But the idea is I will use an unweighted fly on a sinking line, and especially on an intermediate, and you get this lovely action fairly deep because you're using a sinking line. So often you get the best action out of an unweighted fly on the end of a sinking line versus using a weighted fly on a floating line and fishing it at the same depth. So when I've given a choice, I'll often go to an intermediate and an unweighted fly rather than a floating line and a weighted fly. These are the kinds of things that you can sort of judgment calls you can make with the types of flies, mixing them with the types of lines. So I have this as mostly I think of as a sinking line box with a few exceptions. So say the headstander fly is one where I will tend to use more with a floater. But here's two flies I want to talk about because they're very similar. We've got an unweighted rabbit here, and we've got the headstander here. Now, if I fish this unweighted fly on a floating line, it's going to be like a half an inch under the surface. It won't get down at all. If I go with a headstander, depending on how I fish it, I can fish it 2 or 3 feet down with a floating line. If I fish this on an intermediate or a full sinker, I can get it down fairly deep, but it will move very seductively because it's unweighted. If I put this on the end of a full sinker, I can get really deep. If I'm getting into one of those really deep runs where the fish are all snug to the bottom and it's got a lot of fast water on top, I'm going to be using something like this headstander to get underneath all of that. This is not going to get down fast, and something like this will. So I put both these on a full sinking line, but very different circumstances. The headstander is going to be really deep, some fast water on top, and this is going to be a less of a complex situation, not as deep, and I'm going to take advantage of its movement. So those are the kinds of judgments you're going to make whether you're going to be using a headstander fly that's very heavily weighted or an unweighted rabbit fly. Both of them have a rabbit wing. They're both the same size. They both look basically the same in the water, but one is going to get an awful lot deeper than the other. And one doesn't need the line to get it down, and the other one does. The other thing you can look at using is something like my little perch pattern here, which is very, very sparse. A perch pattern like this is going to any streamer like this is very sparse. You can fish on a floating line and it'll be a few inches under the surface, or you can fish on an intermediate and it'll get down. It'll really get down on an intermediate, but it still has that nice action because it's unweighted. So you've got 3 choices there with flies. You can go with something that sinks slowly, needs a line to help it get down. You can get something that's heavily weighted that goes to the bottom like a rock, or you can have an unweighted fly that's sparse, that gets down quite well, but because it's unweighted, it still moves well. So, we can think of those different flies in different applications and different ways to use them and get different results from them. And of course, lastly, we can't go anywhere without talking about poppers. And I have, from very small ones, panfish. I've got some bummers in here I'll use for smallmouth. And you've got these really big ones. You've got mouse patterns. They're great to use in top water action. It's lovely fishing for smallmouth in top water. Just make sure you've got the right leader and the right fly line to push these beasties, because they have a lot of drag and they don't cast smoothly. So unless you've got a good casting stroke and the right line, then you can make them work quite fine. But if you are struggling to cast, stick with one of those sparse flies I showed you with sparse streamer. Don't get into some of these until you've got your casting down smoothly, because they can frustrate you quite quickly. But nevertheless, they're great fish catchers. I primarily use them on deeper, slower runs, moving into the evening, afternoon to evening. When the sun starts coming off the pool, they're often when they work the best. Now, I'm going to move on a little bit further, talking about basically the gear I'm carrying, wearing, when I'm on the water, because that's a little different from trout fishing. I have this sling pack that I use for my gear, and I usually wet wade when I'm fishing for smallmouth because it's the middle of the summer. So my car keys, my phone, my wallet, they're all in the sling pack. And you can, if you're worried about keeping them dry, you can put them in a Ziploc bag, put them in the sling pack, and if you fall in the water, you'll probably keep them dry. Now for wet wading, I have these neoprene socks that I pull over a pair of regular socks, and they go into my wading boots. So this is like having the feet of your stocking foot waders, but without the waders. Very, very handy to get, and they fold down and become gravel guards. It's fantastic. As far as a hat is concerned, this is my 30-year-old Tilly. I know ball caps. Everybody likes ball caps. But we're talking about the middle of the summer, guys. A broad-brimmed hat, especially a white one, is going to keep you cool and keep you comfortable. And you'll be out in the water a lot longer if you're comfortable, and you won't get as sunburned as badly than if you wear a ball cap. So, yeah, look for a white broad-brimmed hat, or this one's sort of more of a cream color, but something that's a light color that reflects the sun, and it'll give you a chance to stay out in the water a lot longer. And the other thing I'll talk about is my wading pants. These are a little bit different. These come with a liner, so you don't need underwear with them. So you can get quite wet with these, and they dry off extremely quickly. You walk out of the water, and they shed water very, very fast. So by the time you've got your rod and your gear put away, and you get in the car, these are just a bit damp. They shed water very fast, and you can wade past your waist without worrying too much about them. So I have like 3 or 4 pairs of these, and they're great for wet wading. I don't like to use shorts when I wet wade. A lot of people do. No problem with that. The trouble is your legs are exposed to all of the nasty stuff that you might run into, like rocks and what have you. Having pants on gives you just that little bit of extra protection. And also, you could run into a leech, and having those on instead of shorts, you don't have to worry about leeches. You're fully sealed up. So that's what I've got on. Wading boots, those neoprene socks with a pair of regular socks underneath, my wading pants, I've got a belt that can stand getting wet, and I've got my sling pack. And that with my nice broad-brimmed hat, I'm comfortable in the water. I can stand out there all day and fish, and no problem at all. It's about being comfortable. So that's basically it. That's what how I work, and the types of flies I use, the type of gear I use. And I'll just recap. If you're going to go buy a smallmouth rod, get yourself a 6-weight. You don't have to spend much on the reel unless you think you're going to run into some carp. Just don't get one too cheap that's sloppy, that's all. As far as lines, if I'm going to start off with a line, I'll go with a bass bug type floating line to start with. You could up line going up one size. It'll work just fine. And it makes casting big flies easier. The next line purchase should be looking at an intermediate with a floating running line, and finally a full sinker with a floating running line. As far as flies are concerned, you've seen my 6 essential flies, but you want to have some poppers, you want to have a mix of types of streamers, and weighted and unweighted. And as far as leaders are concerned, they're fairly simple. You can make your own, or you can buy them. Just remember, if you're throwing poppers, shorten them. Give them about 7 feet, and you're good to go. So that's my stuff for fishing smallmouth. So get out there and have some fun and catch some fish. Cheers. There we go.
Just that question.
Yep. Now there's